Police sirens echoed through Willow Creek for the third time that month. Blue and red lights flashed across perfectly trimmed lawns, while curtains moved quietly behind expensive windows. And standing alone on his porch was 82-year-old Walter Hayes. Again, Officer Daniels stepped out of the patrol car with visible embarrassment. "Sorry, sir," he sighed. "We received another complaint." Walter adjusted his old gray sweater and gave the same gentle nod he always gave. "I understand, officer." Across the street, Richard Sterling stood beside his black SUV, pretending to check his mail. But the smug smile on his face said everything. Walter noticed it and said nothing. Daniels glanced around awkwardly. What was the complaint this time? He already knew the answer would be ridiculous. Walter looked genuinely confused. "I believe they said my wind chimes were aggressive." Daniels almost laughed. Aggressive wind chimes. The old man's tiny porch only had two small metal bells hanging beside dying flower baskets. A cold breeze moved them softly. Tiny peaceful sounds. Nothing more. Daniels rubbed his forehead. "I'm sorry, Mr. Hayes." Walter smiled faintly. "You're only doing your job." Daniels nodded and returned to the car, while neighbors watched silently from windows. As the patrol car disappeared, Richard slowly crossed the street. Expensive shoes. Perfect haircut. Arrogant grin. "You know," Richard said loudly, "most people would take the hint by now." Walter kept watering his flowers. "This neighborhood has standards." No response. Richard's smile faded slightly. "You really enjoy embarrassing yourself, don't you?" Walter finally looked at him. Not angry. Not afraid. Just tired. "My wife planted these roses," he said softly. "They need water every morning." Richard scoffed. "You're stubborn." Walter turned back to the garden. "And you're loud." For half a second, Richard's expression darkened. Then he forced another fake smile. "You should have sold when I offered." Walter remained calm. "This house isn't for sale." Richard leaned closer. "One way or another." His smile disappeared completely. "You'll leave." He walked away. Walter watched him enter the giant mansion across the street before quietly sitting on his porch chair. The neighborhood had changed. Years ago, children played outside until sunset. Neighbors shared meals. People cared about each other. Now everyone competed. Bigger cars. Bigger houses. Bigger fences. And Richard Sterling ruled Willow Creek through fear and money. Walter closed his eyes for a moment. The silence reminded him of his wife. Margaret loved quiet mornings. Loved gardening. Loved this tiny house everyone now mocked. After she died, Walter stopped caring what the world thought. All he wanted was peace. But Richard Sterling refused to let him have it. The next morning, Walter walked slowly home carrying grocery bags. Halfway down the street, he stopped. Trash covered his lawn. Broken eggs dripped from the porch railing. And spray paint covered the garage door. "Go away." Walter stared silently at the mess. Several neighbors peeked through blinds. Nobody came outside. Nobody helped. Across the street, Richard watched while sipping coffee. Walter slowly placed the grocery bags down. Then quietly began cleaning. No yelling. No anger. Just silence. An hour later, Officer Daniels arrived again. This time he looked furious. "What happened?" Walter kept scrubbing paint from the garage. "Kids, probably." Daniels frowned. "That doesn't look like kids." Walter didn't answer. Daniels lowered his voice. Mr. Hayes off the record. He glanced toward Richard's mansion. Is he the one doing this? Walter continued scrubbing. I don't make accusations without proof. Daniels stared at him carefully. Most people would have exploded weeks ago. But Walter never insulted anyone. Never blamed anyone. Never even complained. That bothered Daniels more than anything. That night Richard hosted another neighborhood party. Luxury cars lined the street while music echoed through Willow Creek. Walter sat alone on his porch, reading an old book under a dim yellow light. Around midnight police arrived again. This time 4 patrol cars. Neighbors gathered outside immediately. Richard stepped forward dramatically. Officers thanked God. Daniels exited the vehicle. What's going on? Richard pointed toward Walter's house. There are reports of illegal firearms. Murmurs spread through the crowd. Walter slowly stood from his porch chair. Daniels looked uncomfortable. Sir, we need permission to search the property. Walter nodded calmly. Of course. Inside the small house, everything smelled like old books and coffee. Family photographs lined the walls. A younger Walter smiled beside a beautiful woman with bright eyes. Margaret. The officers searched closets, cabinets, drawers. Nothing. One rookie officer opened an old wooden box in the study. Inside sat dusty plaques and newspaper clippings. The officer froze. Ugh. Daniels walked over, then stopped cold. One plaque read, Honorable Judge WLTERHHAYS. Daniels blinked. He looked at the old man standing quietly near the doorway. The rookie officer whispered, Wait, that Judge Hayes. Walter calmly closed the box. That was a long time ago. Daniels stared at him differently now. Not as a helpless old man, but as someone important. Someone powerful once. Richard stepped inside impatiently. Well, Daniels turned sharply. There's nothing here. Richard forced a laugh. Really, that's surprising. Daniels didn't like his tone. Walter walked the officers to the door. Before leaving, Daniels quietly asked, You were a judge? Walter gave a small nod. Retired. Daniels wanted to ask more, but Walter gently closed the door. That night Daniels couldn't sleep, so he searched the name online. And what he discovered shocked him. Article after article appeared. The Iron Judge. Walter Hayes had once presided over some of the largest corruption trials in state history. Mob connections, political scandals, corporate fraud. Dangerous men feared him. One article showed a younger Walter sentencing a billionaire businessman to 20 years in prison. Another described death threats against him during a major trial. Daniels leaned back slowly. This quiet old man had once terrified criminals. So why was he living alone in silence while being bullied by a rich neighbor? The next morning, Daniels returned alone. Walter opened the door, already knowing why he came. You looked me up. Daniels nodded awkwardly. Yes, Your Honor. Walter sighed softly. I haven't heard that in many years. Daniels stepped inside. The house felt frozen in time. Margaret's knitting basket still sat beside the couch. Her glasses remained on the kitchen counter. Walter noticed Daniels staring. My wife passed away 11 years ago. I'm sorry. Walter nodded once. Daniels finally asked the question bothering him most. Why are you letting Richard do this to you? Walter looked out the window toward the roses. Because angry men destroy themselves eventually. Daniels stayed silent. Walter continued softly. I spent 40 years watching pride ruin people. He folded his hands carefully. Richard believes power protects him. Daniels frowned. And it does. Walter finally looked directly at him. Not forever. Days passed. Then weeks. The harassment continued. More complaints. More inspections. More humiliation. But something had changed. Now Officer Daniels watched Richard closely. And the more he watched, the worse Richard looked. One afternoon Walter returned from the pharmacy and found his mailbox smashed completely apart. Daniels arrived minutes later. This is getting insane. Walter quietly picked broken wood from the grass. Daniels lowered his voice. You know I can push for harassment charges. Walter shook his head. No. Why not? Walter looked toward Richard's mansion. Because he hasn't crossed the line yet. Daniels frowned. What line? Walter's expression turned distant. The line people never come back from. 3 nights later, Richard crossed it. At 2 a.m. security cameras captured a hooded figure entering Walter's backyard. Minutes later flames appeared near the storage shed. Neighbors screamed as fire spread across the fence. Firefighters rushed to contain it before reaching the house. Walter stood outside, wrapped in a blanket while smoke filled the air. Daniels reviewed nearby footage immediately. Then froze. A black luxury SUV appeared exiting the alley seconds after the fire started. Richard Sterling's SUV. Daniels drove straight to Richard's mansion. Richard opened the door furious. This is harassment. Daniels stepped closer. No, he said coldly. What you've been doing to Walter Hayes. He held up the tablet showing security footage. That's harassment. For the first time, Richard looked nervous. You can't prove that's me. But neighbors had started gathering outside. Watching. Listening. And suddenly Mrs. Russo spoke. The elderly widow from 2 houses down. I heard you threaten him last month. Richard turned sharply. What? Another neighbor stepped forward. You bragged about forcing him out. Then another voice joined. And you vandalized his property. Richard's confidence cracked visibly. For months the neighborhood stayed silent. But now, the fear was breaking. People began talking all at once. About the fake complaints. The bullying. The intimidation. Daniels watched Richard carefully. The powerful man who once controlled everyone suddenly looked small. Very small. The story exploded online the next morning. Security footage spread everywhere. News stations replayed clips of Walter standing silently during endless police visits. Then reporters discovered who he really was. Retired Judge Walter Hayes. The Iron Judge. Public outrage erupted instantly. Former lawyers gave interviews praising him. Retired officers defended him publicly. Old courtroom footage resurfaced online. Meanwhile, Richard's business reputation collapsed overnight. Clients disappeared. Neighbors avoided him. Even the HOA president resigned publicly after leaked emails revealed Richard pressured the board into targeting Walter. And through all of it, Walter remained quiet. No interviews. No public revenge. No celebrations. That silence destroyed Richard more than anger ever could. One rainy evening Richard finally crossed the street alone. No designer suit. No confidence. Walter sat on the porch holding warm coffee. Richard's eyes looked exhausted. Please, he whispered. Walter said nothing. Richard's voice cracked. My company's collapsing. Silence. My friends won't answer calls. Walter looked at him calmly. I never wanted this. Richard laughed bitterly. Wanted this? You think I wanted this? Walter took a slow sip of coffee. You wanted power. Richard's breathing became shaky. I was trying to protect property value. Walter stared at him for several long seconds, then quietly asked, at the cost of another human being. Richard couldn't answer. Walter set the coffee down carefully. You called the police on me every week. Rain tapped softly against porch railings. Now the truth is answering back. Richard lowered his head, and for the first time since moving into Willow Creek, he looked ashamed. Weeks later, the neighborhood gathered outside Walter's house. Children planted new flowers in the garden. Veterans shook his hand respectfully. Families brought food. Officer Daniels walked toward the porch, carrying something wrapped in cloth. Walter looked confused. Daniels carefully uncovered it. The restored judge plaque. Polished perfectly. Walter stared silently at the engraved letters. Honorable Judge Waltrays. His eyes filled with tears instantly. She would have loved this, he whispered. Daniel smiled softly. People finally know who you are. Walter looked around the neighborhood. At the smiling families. At the repaired garden. At children laughing near the porch. Then he shook his head gently. No. He smiled faintly. They finally remembered how to be neighbors.